1869, British cultural historian Kenneth Clark, when discussing the painters of the Renaissance, referred to Leonardo da Vinci as, quote, the most relentlessly curious person in history, end quote. Why might that be the case? Well, let's satisfy our curiosity and find out. Leonardo da Vinci was born in 1452 in a small farming hamlet to the west of Florence, in an area called Vinci. His birth seems to have been the product of a dalliance between an upper middle class notary, a lawyer from Florence, Piero di Antonio, and a local farm girl in Vinci, Caterina. At the age of about 5, Leonardo was brought to the big city, the metropolis of Florence, and, in effect, homeschooled by his father. The fact that young Leonardo was illegitimate of birth had repercussions. Being illegitimate barred him from access to traditional church schools, those of the Roman Catholic Church, and thus it was not possible for him to have a language-based traditional classical education of the sort that his father had had. But Leonardo was able to turn this apparent disadvantage into an advantage. Leonardo would be forced to learn from personal experience rather than reading the writings of ancient authorities. He'd have to get out there and see for himself. And Leonardo had other advantages as well. Not only was he born with a great talent for art, one-to-one hand-eye coordination, for example, and the capacity to freeze frame an object in motion, he had situational advantage. He now lived in the epicenter of Western art during the Renaissance in the region of Tuscany, and specifically in the city of Florence. Florence, the greatest metropolis for the production of art in the Western world. To make the point, I'll suggest the following. Next time you're in an art museum in North America or Western Europe, go into the late medieval, early Renaissance collection and look at the labels which tell you where the art originated. If your experience is like mine, you'll find that about 60 to 70% of the art in that collection comes from the region of Tuscany. If a city is identified, it will sometimes be a Siena, or far more often it will be Florence. Anyway, about the age of 14, Leonardo, having shown a talent for art, was placed by his father as an apprentice to Florentine artist Verrocchio, True Eye, a nickname for artist Andrea di Michele di Francesco di Cioni. Well, no wonder they shortened it to Verrocchio. And Leonardo learned and worked in Verrocchio's studio until he was about 28. So perhaps Leonardo was a genius who, once again, was not necessarily a prodigy. On the screen, you see a sculpture of the youthful David, executed about 1470 by Verrocchio. There's some reason to believe that the young Leonardo, who is legendary for his good looks, served as the model for this sculpture. Next, you see a painting of the baptism of Christ by Verrocchio, and here there is evidence to suggest that the head of the angel was executed by Verrocchio's apprentice, Leonardo. Notice the angel's head. Notice the fineness of the hair. It's all particularly noteworthy. In 1482, Leonardo moved from Florence to an even bigger metropolis, Milan, to work for the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. At about the age of 31, Leonardo was a promising artist, but by no means a household name. Consequently, he had to apply for a job. He had to apply for the job that he wanted to get in Milan, just as we might today. Well, he too had to write a job application letter, a cover letter, advertising all the many things that he could do. We'll return to this letter in our next session, but the point here is that Leonardo could do a lot of things. Why? Because he was curious. Let's look at a typical day in the life of Leonardo. We get a sense of this curious mind by considering what he entered in one of his notebooks while in Milan about 1485. It's a to-do list for a day. First, calculate the measurement of Milan and its suburbs. Find a book describing Milan and its churches. Discover the measurement of the Corte Vecchia, the old courtyard in the ducal palace. Ask the master of arithmetic, Luca Pacioli, to show you how to square a triangle. Ask Benedetto Portinari, a Florentine merchant who happened to be passing through Milan at that time, by what means they go on ice at Flanders. In other words, they ice skate in the Low Countries. Draw Milan. Ask Maestro Antonio how mortars or cannons are positioned on bastions by day or night. Examine the crossbow of Maestro Genetto. Find a master of hydraulics and get him to tell you how to repair a lock, canal, and mill in the Lombard manner. Ask about the measurement of the sun promised by Maestro Giovanni Franceschi. Notice that the words find, discover, examine, and most often ask. Well, I suppose you can't satisfy your curiosity unless you ask about something. The aforementioned notebooks of Leonardo are tangible evidence of his curiosity. In them, he kept track of all the questions he had and all the answers that he found. About 6,000 pages survive of an estimated 13,000 pages of sketches and notes that he wrote. And within the surviving pages today, remember about 10,000 drawings of the sort that you see here on the screen. Why? Why this obsessive curiosity about such diverse things, about such a diverse range and variety of things? Well, Leonardo seems to have believed that to be the painter he wanted to be, he had to understand everything about what he was painting. To paint the Mona Lisa, for example, with her mysterious smile, he had to ask questions. How do the muscles of the lips around the mouth work? Once he understood, he drew the answer, as we see on the right there on the slide of a notebook page of Leonardo himself. And Leonardo's curiosity carried him beyond the field of human anatomy. To learn how to paint the Virgin on the rocks, he studied rocks and shells. To learn how to paint the figures in the Last Supper, he studied geometry. Strangely, although Leonardo was curious to find out more, most often he did not share what he discovered. He just wrote and sketched everything in his private notebooks. It was only many centuries later that medical scientists, for example, became fully aware of his true genius. To make this point, let's turn to a video from a BBC production of 2013 in which cardiologist Francis Wells talks about how Leonardo's brilliance was only belatedly recognized.
The full scope of his scientific accomplishments can be seen in the field of cardiac anatomy, which he carried out towards the end of his career. Intrigued by the way that the aortic valve opens and closes to ensure that blood flows in one direction, Leonardo set about constructing a model, filling an ox's heart with wax. Once the wax had hardened, he recreated the structure in glass and then pumped a mixture of grass seeds suspended in water through it.
This allowed him to observe little vortices as the seeds swirled around in the widening at the base of the aorta. And as a result, and this is the extraordinary thing, Leonardo correctly posited that these vortices helped to actually close the aortic valve. And that would not be observed again for hundreds of years until the 20th century.
One contemporary practitioner who studied this side of Leonardo's work is the heart surgeon Francis Wells.
The first time I really focused on the drawings was when I just qualified as a doctor and I was doing my anatomy for surgery. And once I'd seen them, I thought they were far better than anything we had in a current day modern textbook of anatomy. They were beautiful, they were accurate, and they were absorbing, and there was a liveliness to them. You can look with a magnifying glass at some of the drawings of the interstices of the heart, for example, and the fineness of the shading. It gives you a depth to these drawings, which is technical genius.
What did he find out about the heart?
First and foremost, and it may amaze you to realize it, that the heart was thought of as a two-chambered structure up until and after his time, because of course he never published this. The two ventricles were the heart. The atria, the filling chambers, were regarded as part of the venous system, not part of the heart. Leonardo firmly stated the heart has 4 chambers.
I did bring along a reproduction of a drawing that Leonardo made in which he observes these so-called vortices.
This is a beautiful example of synopsis in thought. In it, he's got the hypothesis for the flow, description of the vortices, and at the top, little diagrams showing how this argument has to be the right one for the mechanism of closure of the valve, and not simple reflux of the blood and how it would fail. Now, this wasn't known about or understood until the last century, and it was shown most beautifully and reported in Nature in 1968 by 2 engineers in Oxford, Bellhouse and Bellhouse. And there's one reference, and that is to Leonardo da Vinci. The reference is 500 years old.
Ironically, the greatest driver of Leonardo's genius, his curiosity, was, with regard to Leonardo's career as a painter, a liability. It's a little-known fact that in his lifetime, Leonardo completed fewer than 25 paintings. Yes, fewer than 25 paintings. He would start a project and become so interested in the science behind it that off his mind would run, and the project would never be finished, leaving us with only the 25, 24 or so paintings that you see on the screen. Remember what Albert Einstein said to David Hilbert in 1915, quote, "My curiosity is interfering with my work." Well, the same thing would often happen to Leonardo. To end this segment, let me share with you my favorite Leonardo quote, along with the only known to be true contemporary likeness of him. Quote, "Read me well, O reader," Leonardo says, "if in my words you find delight, for rarely in the world will one such as I be born again." Notice that Leonardo says, read me well, which carries us to our next lesson. But if it is true that rarely in the world will one such as Leonardo da Vinci be born again, this is likely because he was, as Kenneth Clark said, the most relentlessly curious person in history.